I would begin a broadcast like this with a Gunny Ushla, a Corj Gale, members and supporters of the National Party, and those of you who are simply watching out of curiosity or whatever on social media platforms of various kinds. That, I am acutely aware, is an ambivalent statement at this point, in particular member and supporters of the National Party. For people do not know as of this moment, and many people genuinely have doubts and questions as to what constitutes a member of the National Party, what constitutes a supporter of the National Party, and indeed what constitutes the National Party. This is because of the nefarious attempt by Mr. James Reynolds to assume the leadership of the National Party, to use his access to the social media accounts of the National Party, in particular its Twitter account, its website, its Instagram, so on and so forth, and also the support of a number of faces in the party that would be recognisable, who have endorsed his leadership and therefore somehow are to provide evidence that his leadership is legitimate. Now, I can speculate forever what Mr. Reynolds' motives are in this regard. I don't know why he did it, and I don't know what he intends to achieve. I know what he has achieved in the past 4 months. He has achieved absolutely nothing at all. In the speech that he gave, the reasons why the National Party needed new leadership, apart from a few deeply hurtful exhibitions regarding events many years ago relating to myself, some of them truthful, some of them diverging very much from the truth. Other than that, we have had nothing from Mr. Reynolds. We've had a stuttering, mumbling speech from him at that particular occasion. We have had a stuttering, mumbling speech from him at a meeting of a nationalist group in Budapest, where he gave a false version of Irish history to an Hungarian audience. And if that were not audacious enough, he gave a false version of Hungarian history to a Hungarian nationalist audience. And he did so, well, in fairness to him, you couldn't say he did so with confidence. But he was still audacious enough to try and explain the history of Hungary to the people, a nationalist group in Hungary, who would have known that what he was saying was nonsense, or vaguely, what shall we say, vaguely based on a true story. And his version of Arthur Griffith's vision for Ireland, again, not as we know it, and not as our history tells us it is. But that's neither here nor there, because Mr. Reynolds' efforts to lead the National Party have, in its entirety, been farcical. It is now quite clear that the National Party under his leadership is merely a husk. It is a few of these people, as I've said, faces, names that people will recognise, and therefore their endorsement is supposed to be the entirety of the party. He has the support of the majority of the party, that's what he says. Now, I'll be quite honest with you, I am not particularly interested in whether the democratic will of counting ballots is the legitimate way to choose the leader of a political party. Except in this instance, no such vote has been taken, and therefore to reference the overwhelming support of the party, one would need evidence other than an election, because he hasn't got that. He didn't take the matter of the leadership to an annual general meeting or an Ordesh, which would normally take place in the month of November. And if he had a majority support, you'd think he would do that, but he didn't do that. But in any case, he relies instead upon a meeting that he had, or purports to have had. And I'm going to use this phrase, purports, a lot. And I apologise for that, but it is necessary to do so because I'm going to be using Mr. Reynolds' own words. And when you're using Mr. Reynolds' own words about anything, or any version of events, they are always purported version of events. They are never that version of events. They sometimes are vaguely there or thereabouts. They sometimes have a little bit of truth somewhere at the centre of them, but almost never are they in fact the exact truth. And sometimes they diverge so much from the truth that they are entirely made up. In any case, as I said again, the possession of the social media of the party, the possession of the flags and banners of the party, the possession of the various backdrops and so forth, have allowed Mr. Reynolds and his cohorts to present themselves as somewhat legitimate. And a lot of good people, I imagine, are of the view and of the belief that this coup was in fact legitimate. They're certainly acting as if it is. And this is extraordinary in and of itself, because to pretend that the party is not in crisis is to pretend something that is patently false. To pretend that there isn't a problem, when in fact you are cooperating with a process with the Electoral Commission, which is to decide on the question of the entry in the register of political parties, and then at the same time to act as if there is no crisis, is to basically ignore the reality of the situation. Not only legally, but to ignore the situation on the ground. And what we have seen, of course, is that despite the fact they have various accoutrements of the party and various faces that would be recognisable in supporting Mr. Reynolds' leadership, what they do not have is any numbers. We see the same faces over and over and over again, presented as if they were new people doing new things in new places. Much activism. Much activism is purported to be going on. And of course the social media figures are boosted by the celebrity status of none other than Mr. Keith Woods. Now, I don't know at all what Keith Woods' motives are. Maybe it is, because Mr. Reynolds says it is, that he is a transitional leader, so therefore there is a new leadership coming in. So one might speculate that Mr. Woods has his eye to the idea that he will succeed Mr. Reynolds. But in order to succeed Mr. Reynolds to the leadership of the party, one would in the first place have to have Mr. Reynolds be the leader of the party. And here is the meat on the bone, as it were, which is the statutory declaration that Mr. Reynolds made to the Electoral Commission on why he is the leader of the National Party. He made the statutory declaration on the 18th of September 2023, and as I said, as a statutory declaration, it is a legal sworn document and brings with it certain consequences for making false declarations. So you would think, you'd be very careful, wouldn't you, what you write in a sworn declaration and what you sign off on and swear to. You would think at least, at the very least, you would think you would stay within the bounds of the physically possible. Now, not necessarily the truth, because, well, Mr. Reynolds doesn't do truth, and his cohorts don't do truth. Their purpose is to subvert the National Party, their purpose is to destroy the National Party, and they have gone to great lengths to do so. So truthfulness, honesty, honour, loyalty, these are things that don't matter. But surely we could expect some effort on their part to stay within the bounds of believability. But I'm going to use Mr. Reynolds' own words to show you how it is that he has not even attempted to tell a plausible story. He says, and this is quite extraordinary because he has now given us 4 different versions of why it was that it was necessary to change the leadership of the National Party. But in this one, the 4th version, he declares that the above actions were taken in full compliance with the constitution of the party and done so in order to protect the party from being taken in a direction which threatened both the safety of its membership as well as to preserve the authentic values of the party from being further twisted to a potentially malicious intent. Now, what an extraordinary statement to make in a sworn statement, given that you made this on the 18th day of September, and yet there are 3 other versions that you've already put out as to why the leadership of the party needed to be changed. He doesn't explain how the safety of the membership of the party was threatened, nor does he explain what the authentic values of the party are, or how they were being twisted in malicious intent. Now, what we do know is that subsequent to his declaring himself in charge, Mr. Reynolds committed the party to support Ireland's international obligations to asylum seekers, and in particular to the Ukrainian refugees who are supposedly genuine and here in the country as genuine. He says they are, and he says we have international obligations to them, and he as the leader of the National Party does not have any problem with that. Those legal obligations must be upheld. Is this the authentic values of the party? Well, it's not the party I formed, it's not the party I led, it's not the party anyone joined, and so where the authenticity of this policy comes from, I do not know. I could give you another example in his support for, or at least the party's support for, Zionism. A particularly unfortunate moment in history to align yourself with the Zionist cause. But Mr. Reynolds decided to do that. Again, are these the authentic values of the National Party? Are these the values that people joined on? Or are these simply the clumsiness of somebody who really doesn't know what they're doing or what they're saying? I would suggest to you that this particular declaration here, which is registered as number 3 on the paper, I declare the actions were taken to be in full compliance with the constitution of the party, are somewhat contradicted by the letter that the Electoral Commission sent on August the 24th, in which they said that they had a copy of an email from Mr. Reynolds of August 2nd, 2023, and they had been advised that there had been a call from Mr. Paul McWheeny in relation to the constitution of the National Party held by the Commission. The Commission had to answer to them to the effect that they could not provide a certified copy of the Constitution on request because the one they held on file might not reflect the current adopted version thereof. So in other words, Mr. Reynolds has made a sworn declaration that his actions are in full compliance. His actions on July the 14th were in full compliance with the Constitution of the National Party. And he is asking the Electoral Commission on the 2nd of August to tell him what the National Party Constitution says. Extraordinary. So he proceeds. He proceeds pretty much to assume that the Constitution has not been changed by myself. Which of course it hasn't, because it can't be. It can't be changed without the presence of the National Directorate, which is the governing body of the party. And that is myself and himself as of this moment, the only two remaining elected members of the National Directorate. He proceeds to say that on July the 14th, 2023, now you'll remember a statement some time back in which this meeting took place in mid-July because they couldn't really figure out exactly when was a good time to say that it had happened. It had to happen before July the 18th, obviously, because it had to happen before Mr. Conroy and Mr. Reynolds removed the gold reserves of the National Party from the party vault to a vault in their own name. Because if they didn't have this meeting and they didn't have the legitimate leadership of the party in their hands on July the 18th, then they had committed a criminal offence. But they weren't sure what to say the date was, so they went with mid-July. But by the time he got to the Statutory Declaration, in any case, Mr. Reynolds had decided that he was in fact the 14th of July, which is good of him, to finally come to some conclusion as to when this thing happened. He makes a number of amendments to the Constitution. He says that Mr. Barrett is removed as party president. He says that Mr. Reynolds has been elected party president, and there are certain amendments to be made to the party's registration. He says that Mr. Barrett is to be, his access to the party's bank accounts is to be revoked, and he says that Mr. Barrett's is to be dismissed from the National Directorate. You can see how crucial this particular statement is in that context, because everything hinges then on what happened on the 14th of July. Because he's first of all making a guess at what he's allowed to do under the Constitution and what the Constitution provides for. And having made a guess, subsequent to August the 2nd, he then proceeds to tell us that this is what he did on July the 14th. On July the 14th, Mr. Reynolds had a meeting at which indeed he made a number of amendments that are referred to as the Resolution Number 1, a number of amendments to the Constitution. But he also has minutes. He has minutes from that meeting. Oh, by the way, he certifies that this is the original document that was adopted by the National Directorate of the National Party on the 14th of July 2023, signed James Reynolds. So he is amending a constitution that he is not sure what is in it until sometime after the 2nd of August. He makes a guess that it is probably the original constitution that he had in front of him. He certifies that he did this on July the 14th. He made amendments to a constitution that he wasn't entirely sure what the contents of that constitution were. Now, I don't know how you can amend a document if you don't have the original document, but Mr. Reynolds purports to have done so. The minutes, and as I say, this is the real meat on the bone. Meeting of the National Directorate, 14th of July 2023. This meeting was held on the 14th of July 2023 in Edgeworthstown, County Longford. Below follows in chronological order details of the resolutions and motions adopted by the meeting. Attendance. Present, James Reynolds. Absent, Justin Barrett. 50% of the National Director's members were present at the meeting and the quorum was attained. Now, I know where he gets this from. It's somewhat illiterate, but you know, what can you do? It's not my fault. I didn't make this rubbish up. He gets this from the proper constitution, which he did have in his possession, that is, in which it says, is a national directorate meeting shall be considered quorate where 50% or more of its membership are present. Now, I'm going to read that sentence again because it's quite important. A National Directorate meeting shall be considered quorate where 50% or more of its membership are present. Later on in the Constitution, which is only, by the way, 2 pages long, very simple, very, very, very simple, and very straightforward. The National Directorate shall consist of no less than 2 members and no more than 12. The National Directorate must appoint 2 responsible officers, President and Secretary of Finances are to be handled. Now, it's quite obvious, therefore, that when the reference was made to a meeting being quorate at 50%, that what was envisaged here was a National Directorate that would have more than 2 members. It would have, say, 3 members, of which 2 were present. It would have 4 members, of which 2 were present. That would be quorate. It would have 8 members, of which 4 were present. That would be quorate. But if there are only 2 members, then the issue of whether the 50% were there or not is actually irrelevant. And it's irrelevant for this very simple reason. You can't have a meeting by yourself. Yeah, I didn't just freeze there. I just wanted you to concentrate on that phrase. Mr. Reynolds purports that on the 14th of July 2023 in Edgeworthstown, County Longford, he had a meeting with himself, by himself, on his own, and declared I'm sorry. He proceeded to make a number of amendments, which I won't even bother to read out because it's just so ridiculous after he's there. He's not by himself. He's on his own. Attendance, present, Mr. Reynolds. Absent, Mr. Barrett. He makes a series of amendments to the Constitution, which I'll come back to only because they're interesting in terms of the motivation of the people who have supported Mr. Reynolds through this process. But he's done so by himself. And he has elected himself the President of the National Party. He has, in fact, once again, you can see his signature there. He has elected himself as membership of the party. motions were approved, all of them. Mr. Reynolds moves a motion to immediately proceed with the election of a party president. Motion is approved by 100% of the National Directorate members present. James Reynolds is duly elected president of the National Party by himself on his own in a room with no one else there. And in accordance with the Constitution that he wasn't sure of the contents of on August the 2nd, but he was absolutely certain on July the 14th that he could do this. He proceeds to change various things in the register of the political parties. Again, he proposes these motions himself. He votes by himself. He goes on to make a number of amendments supposedly to the party registration. This is once again at the meeting that he is by himself on his own without anybody else there. And all of these motions naturally are approved by 100%. 100% of himself. He was absolutely unanimous in all the changes he wanted to make to the registration of the party. But this goes to the heart of why some of the people, the faces that are purported to support Mr. Reynolds, might have decided that they wanted a new leadership. Because Mr. Reynolds has decided to add some people to the National Directorate. He has added Mr. Jerry Knievy, and he has added Mr. Paul McQueenie, and he has added Mr. Paul Conroy. Once again, he certifies this was the original document. He then goes on by himself, on his own, without anybody else present, to make amendments to the party registration. All of these motions are passed by 100% of himself, by himself, on his own. Saddam Hussein style results for the various referenda that he carried out. But there's an explanation, I think, for the names, the faces, that everybody says, oh, well, why are they supporting Mr. Reynolds? Aren't they very close to the leadership of the National Party? And wouldn't they be in a position to know if Mr. Barrett, that is myself, was actually capable of and running the party to the best of my ability, at least, and to the better ability than Mr. Reynolds? And much is made about this. Not that it matters legally, but much is made of this. Except that Mr. Reynolds has decided to make some appointments to the National Directorate. He has appointed Jerry Keaveney, Paul McQueenie, and Paul Conroy. Now, Paul Conroy, you'll remember from the earlier gold removal. Paul Conroy, of course, is not to appear in the register of the political party so that his name does not appear in public. Once again, we find Mr. Conroy wants power within the party, but doesn't want his name associated with the party and doesn't want to be known. Even at this stage, this late stage of the 18th of September, he still thinks that he can remain anonymous. At this stage, by the way, Mr. Reynolds has now appointed more members of the National Directorate than were ever elected. And he needed to change the Constitution to do that because, of course, members of the National Directorate were supposed to be elected by the annual general meeting. He has changed that and given himself the power to appoint members of the National Directorate. And he has given the National Directorate the power to dismiss the President. Extraordinary, because now nobody who is elected to anything is in control of the party, according to the version that Mr. Reynolds has provided. Aren't you a little sick and tired of this sham? Aren't you a little sick and tired of this farce? Mr. Reynolds tells us that he held a meeting on July the 14th by himself. That's not possible. I'm not saying that's not true. It's obviously not true. I'm saying it's not possible. It's not possible to have a meeting with yourself. That's dissociative personality disorder. It's a mental illness, and a very serious one, if one could do it. But I'll go with Occam's razor here and give you a far simpler explanation. He is lying. Mr. Reynolds says he met by himself. He had a meeting by himself. He then made a series of amendments to a constitution that he didn't know for certain what the contents of that constitution were. He then elected himself as the president of the National Party. He then, with the changes made to the constitution providing that he can nominate people to the National Directorate, he puts 3 people, including one of these cohorts in the theft of the gold reserves of the party, onto the National Directive. And this meeting, which he attends by himself on his own, he takes minutes. He writes them down. He's the only one there. He keeps a record of himself proposing things, of how many votes there were. 1 for each of the items. He lists out all of the items, and then he signs them at a meeting that he attended by himself. Now I can tell you for a fact that no minutes were ever taken at any meeting of the National Directorate of the party, the formal National Directorate, because it had only 2 members. And having only 2 members, it wasn't necessary to take minutes or write down resolutions or to keep records of the decisions that were made. The vast majority of the decisions made by the party, for example, are made under the powers of the President. The President is authorised and responsible for, in consultation with the National Directors. Number 4 being probably the most important, the overall day-to-day decision-making within the party, excepting only where such responsibilities are appropriately delegated. So it is not very difficult, under such circumstances, for the party to function without a National Directorate in place. And therefore, consequently, National Directorate meetings were extremely informal insofar as they took place, and they never had minutes taken. They never had resolutions. Nobody proposed any, nobody voted on any. And there was no need. There was simply a requirement that for the purposes of those issues which lay outside the authorisation of the President, that Mr. Reynolds and I be in agreement on them. And the 2 of us would have had to have been there. That's all, just the 2 of us. Now any number of extra people could be there, and indeed at National Directorate meetings there were often several people there in an advisory capacity. The national organiser was at most National Directorate meetings, for example. because of course he had intimate knowledge of the questions that would be discussed. He did not have a decision-making power, but it was important to consult him. There were various other people at National Directorate meetings, common leaders and so on and so forth, who would be responsible for enacting decisions that would be taken at National Directorate meetings. And it was important to have their input into whether it was practical to implement said decisions. And there would be a discussion and a round table and a back and forth and so on and so forth. But the crucial part was that that at all meetings, Mr. Reynolds was present and I was present. There was normally 2 weeks given as notice for any kind of advisory meeting we would have like this. Simply because obviously all of the people that we wanted to be there needed to be there, and to maximise that required giving people some notice. But for the meeting of July the 14th, which Mr. Reynolds had by himself, he states that an email was sent to myself, not to the email address that I use, not to any email address I've ever seen, and this is an email I've never seen to this day. An email was sent to myself informing me that the meeting was going to take place on July the 14th. Had I known the meeting was going to take place on July the 14th and had I attended it, of course it would have been a 50-50 split on all of the motions that Mr. Reynolds proposes. Yet, he says I was given on the evening of July the 13th, notice of a meeting that took place on July the 14th. What on earth use would be less than 24 hours notice? Why on earth would he have somebody present who was going to vote against anything that was proposed in the full knowledge that that would create a tied situation and therefore the motion would fail? Yet that's exactly what he says happened. Now, the sheer incompetence of Mr. Reynolds' leadership, supposedly, of the party in the last 4 months is dramatic and awe-inspiring. I say that with great conviction because it is extremely difficult to take what was not a large political party. We are aware of that. We are aware of the difficulties we have. And we are aware of the long hill that we have to climb in terms of what we want to achieve in the long run. But he has completely destroyed that party in the intervening time. It now has no credibility whatsoever. 3 or 4 people are pictured everywhere handing out leaflets. 3 or 4 people are pictured everywhere, the same 3 or 4 people holding banners. The same 3 or 4 people are essentially the heart and core, the soul and the existence of the new National Party. In order to avoid that farcical situation, I, in the belief that this process would be over and completed many months ago, made the decision to tell the loyal members of the National Party that they were to stay on standby for the time being. It is not possible, obviously, to maintain that position in current circumstances, because the Electoral Commission has taken a look at Mr. Reynolds' submission, has taken a look at his Statutory Declaration. They've taken a look at how impossible it was for any of these things to have happened. They have taken a look at my own Statutory Declaration, which declares exactly the statements that I have made to you before. especially that Mr. Reynolds was expelled from the party on July the 24th, 2023. That would be the, as it were, the most important one. They have looked at both of those and they have decided that they cannot make up their minds, despite the fact that Mr. Reynolds is claiming something that is impossible. And I am just stating the facts. So they have asked for further information. Now all I can see coming from this further information is a dragging out of the process and a continuation of the stalling and the freezing, not just of the assets of the National Party in terms of money, in terms of gold reserves, and in terms of the continued possession, at this stage, what can only be described as the illegal possession of the property of the party in terms of flags, banners and so on and so forth, and their illegal use. They are also the fraudulent collection of money in the name of the party by people who are not clearly the leadership of the party. The use of the social media of the party, that this is going to continue, that this is going to be permitted to continue for how long, I don't know. But it's certainly not been solved in the couple of weeks that it ought to have been solved in. Again, supporters of the coup have made much of the fact that I said that Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Conway would be arrested. And indeed, they would have been arrested had they not claimed that they moved the gold under proper authority. Well, we see what their proper authority actually was. So, although their criminal prosecution has been delayed, it has not been prevented. And it is my understanding, and I have checked this, is that that criminal prosecution will proceed as soon. The investigation is currently considered to be in being, and the prosecution will proceed as soon as there is clarity as to who the real leadership was, or who had rightful custody of the party's property. And that is the situation we are in. And that is the situation which these people have created. And they have done this in the run-up to what they say is the most important elections, local and European, next June, for which they are not and cannot be remotely prepared. And yet they have sacrificed all of that in order to block a criminal prosecution against themselves. And Mr. McGuiney and Mr. Kneavy appear to just have gone along for their own personal ambitions, to be part of a national directorate of a party that simply doesn't exist. As I say, I could speculate as to the motives of Mr. Keith Woods in supporting this, but there's no point in doing that. I don't know. It's madness. Why anybody can continue to support this situation, again, I don't know. But I can't continue to accept the stalling measure. And as such, I have presented to you this evening the conclusive evidence in Mr. Reynolds' own words, not mine, in Mr. Reynolds' own words, why he is not the leader of the National Party, why none of the amendments to the Constitution he made are correct, why he did not have the authority to move the assets of the party, why Mr. Conroy and himself do not have the right to hold the assets of the party, whereas they do not have the right either to use the social media or the name or anything associated with the National Party that was formed in 2016 and registered in 2019 with the Registrar of Political Parties. That should be the end of it. For God's sake, have the decency to simply withdraw. It's been said to me time and time again, why don't you withdraw for the sake of the party, for the sake of the country? Well, we've seen the mess they've made of it in the 4 months that they have had control of it. So that answers itself as to why I wouldn't withdraw. But why they won't withdraw, knowing they're lying, the only reason, the only plausible excuse is to avoid a criminal prosecution for a theft that they knew was a theft when they did it. There is no excuse for it. There is no excuse for these people's place in Irish politics anymore in any fashion, and certainly not in nationalist circles. I have my arguments with other people and other individuals as to whether they are pursuing the right strategy or they are pursuing the right tactics or whether they are saying the right things. And that's, that's a matter of opinion. And I will put forward my opinion and they will put forward theirs. But these people, anybody who had part in this coup, anyone who had part in this nonsense, has no place in the nationalist movement. And it is striking that the only person stupid enough to put his signature to a sworn statement of what is absolutely impossible to have happened, not merely did not happen, but is absolutely impossible to have happened, is Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Conroy's signature appears nowhere. Mr. McGreeny's signature appears nowhere. Mr. Kenevy's signature appears nowhere. Mr. Quinlivan's signature appears nowhere. Mr. McCarthy's signature appears nowhere. In other words, no one's neck is in the noose in this one, except for the stuttering Egypt that currently pretends to be the leader of the National Party. I reassert the statement I made at the beginning of this mess. Order must be restored. Truth will out. Right must triumph. So I reassert what I said at the very beginning of this mess, which is that order must be restored, that the legitimate leadership of the party must be restored, that the assets of the party must be restored to that legitimate leadership, and that we begin the process of repairing the damage that has been done by these conspirators, who are now laid bare in the farce that they have created. Beyond question, beyond doubt, in their own words, they have said it. They have done it. It's not my opinion. It's Mr. Reynolds' own signature appears 3 times on declarations of the impossible. What the legal consequences are for him is a matter for him. What is a matter for Irish nationalists, what is a matter for the members and supporters of the true National Party, that is now, I think, as a result of the statement I have just made, no longer ambiguous, no longer ambivalent, no longer really in doubt, that we proceed to rebuild that party, ironically, I will use the phrase, in accordance with the authentic values with which we began in 2016 and which we will continue until we have achieved our goals.